Okay, very good afternoon to everybody. Firstly, I would like to thank the conference organizers for having given me the possibility to participate in this fascinating event. And I would like to apologize for not having been able to give my presentation in person, but a family issue has not allowed me to be there with you today. Scottish Gaelic is still an endangered and consequently minority language, although important attempts to preserve and revitalize it are being made since last century, as orthography always plays a fundamental role in the process of preservation and revitalization of an endangered language because it provides a standardized system for reading, writing, and transmitting the language across generations. The aim of this paper is to provide a historical overview of the evolution of the Scottish Gaelic orthography and examine the adequacy and accuracy of the most important reforms that have been implemented in order to improve its orthography and to make the language easier to learn. After this historical overview, this paper will examine the phoneme grapheme correspondence in this language and attempt to identify possible inconsistencies and uncertainties in the orthography, and if this is the case, to offer a solution to improve its effectiveness from an educational perspective. Scottish Gaelic belongs to the Gaelic branch of the Celtic language family that is spoken by only about 57,000 speakers in a number of dialectal forms throughout northwestern Scotland mainly. This means that only 1.1% of Scotland's population speaks the language today. Hence, it is currently classified by UNESCO as definitely in danger. Until a few centuries ago, the Gaeltacht, or Gaelic-speaking region, that is the Gaelic-speaking area, that has included much more of modern-day Scotland, but now this region has been reduced massively to the present region of the Outer Hebrides, the Northwestern Highlands, the Isle of Skye, and a Island Bute, with a small Gaelic population existing in Glasgow and Edinburgh. In the recent years, however, there have emerged some signs of green shoots pointing to recovery, such as the increase in those groups aged under 20 years, the spread of Gaelic speakers beyond this region, and the growth of Gaelic education throughout Scotland, which are certainly grounds for optimism and confirm, consequently, that the long-standing project of preservation and revitalization is now bearing fruit. An important pillar on which this project has rested was the choice of a common standard orthography for the different dialects. This obviously benefits the community by extending opportunities for communication and enhancing the status and legitimacy of the language, since it offers both prestige to the endangered language and can foster its learning and teaching, thereby contributing to its preservation and revitalization. In summary, for languages undergoing revitalization, such as Scottish Gaelic, a standard orthography is not merely a tool for writing, but a fundamental aspect of preserving the language, cultural, and linguistic integrity. However, the process of graphization of this language has not been a bed of roses, as the process of developing a standardized writing system has been a complex and gradual attempt influenced by social, historical, and linguistic factors, and early attempts to standardize Gaelic orthography were inconsistent, since mainly the Scottish Gaelic language was primarily oral. It is generally believed that the Gaelic was established in Scotland when the Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Dalriada in northeast of Ireland expanded to include Argyllshire sometime around 500. The earliest form of Gaelic writing, which correspond to the primitive Gaelic period, are the stone inscriptions called ogan, most of which consist of personal names and marks, possibly indicating land ownership. Thanks to the arrival and spread of Celtic Christianism from Ireland in the 6th century, Gaelic continued to expand across Scotland, and the Roman alphabet displaced the Ogan alphabet, which meant that the foundation stone of modern Gaelic orthography. This early period of language, from the adoption of Latin alphabet to around 900, is designated as Old Gaelic or Old Irish. And on the evidence remaining, it appears that Gaelic grammar had little synchronic vibration. The written language from 1200 is known, to 1600 is known as modern or classical Gaelic, and was used in Ireland and Scotland as a formal written convention that already reflected dialectal divergences between Irish and Scottish Gaelic. In the modern or classical Gaelic period, Gaelic, the language already reflected dialectal divergences, which gradually ceased to be used by Scottish royal court, being replaced by Scots in the court and in burghs, became a rigid and unchanging standard model and gradually differ from any spoken dialect. In the 18th century, Scottish Gaelic broke completely with the Irish language and is considered to be the key period for the development of a Scottish Gaelic orthography based on the contemporary vernacular. As writers at that time tried to give prestige to the vernacular and emphasize the distinctiveness of Scottish Gaelic by seeking a distance to it from Irish Gaelic. The process of translating religious texts, especially the New Testament, into Gaelic during the 18th and 19th centuries had a profound impact on the written form of the language, and the orthography used in these translations became the foundation for much of the subsequent Gaelic writing. The Bible translations helped to unify dialects and introduce a more standardized orthographic system that was used across regions, promoted a more formal and literary style of Gaelic, and contributed to the survival of the language during a time when Gaelic was increasingly under pressure from English. Besides this, the fact that the Bible was one of the few texts people had access to, and it was used both in the church and in the schools, helped to keep the language alive. Over the 18th century, systematic attempts to codify and refine a pure written standard of Scottish Gaelic were complemented by initiatives to record the language. Examples of these initiatives are the poet Alasdair MacDonald, who composed the first dictionary printed in Scottish Gaelic, and Reverend Alasdair MacFarlane, who translated Richard Baxter's religious text. These two Alasdairs are designated as the founding fathers of Gaelic orthography, since with them the language itself was rebranded within a national Scottish context. In the 20th century, the orthography of scriptural translation became a problem because it was based on Southern Gaelic, and the Southern dialects were dying, and writers and editors were coming from the West and the North. So a number of influential works appeared in the first decade of the 20th century, showed the interest in collecting dialect variation. However, after having so much diversity, a need for uniformity was also felt clearly since the middle of the 20th century, especially because the language shift from Gaelic to English accelerated after the World Wars. And consequently, educational needs changed, which leads to attempts to standardize the orthography of the Scottish Gaelic. This led to the important orthography reforms that reached up to the early 21st century, especially thanks to the initiatives of the Gaelic Orthographic Conventions of 1981, 2005, and 2009. In the 1981, the educational authorities in Scotland became concerned about the competence of candidates in Scottish Gaelic and decided to draw up guidelines on Scottish Gaelic spelling. The first report entitled Gaelic Orthographic Conventions, and known as GOC, was published in this year, and its remit was to remove the inconsistencies, indecisions, and minor irritations that arise from the absence of a firmly defined standard. And in doing this, so they will help teachers and learners, and indeed all writers of the Gaelic in general, to write the language more confidently. A brief summary of the changes this GOC are offered below. As regards consonants, the reform tried to remove all ambiguity without making use of an over-proliferation of symbols, clarify the few exceptions to the spelling rule that regulates Scottish Gaelic language, which states that a broad vowel next to a consonant must be paired with a broad vowel on the other side, and similarly, a slender vowel on one side needs to be paired with another slender on the other side. The traditional spelling or historical spelling should be given preference and be retained in case of discrepancy. With respect to vowels, the reform tried to solve the problem regarding the pronunciation of some digraphs like EU, proposed that homophones should be differentiated in spelling, standardized the representation of a long, mid-high, and rounded back vowel, and stated that the spelling of schwa in an stressed syllable should correspond to the letter A, not other letters. It also decided to remove the acute accent and that the grave accent should exclusively use to indicate length, and also regularize the way that compounds should be spelled depending on the position of the stress. Additionally, the reform tried to solve some problems related to the spelling of compounds, which were written sometimes as a single word, sometimes as two words, and sometimes were hyphenated. Finally, the reform attempted to regularize the way that borrowed words should be spelled. Years later, the publication of GOC in 2005 aimed to review and update the format edition, while adhering to the principles and recommendations contained in the original. It tried to make explanations more consistent and clearer, and added exceptions and more examples, including a list of nearly 2,000 words to illustrate more fully the application of the conventions. So the updated document is much easier to use. Among the innovations, we could highlight the recommendations to spell some initial consonant clusters and prefixes, the use of the grave accent to differentiate some homophonous words, the distinction between sign diagrams like EA and IO, the representation of some adverbial compounds and nominal compounds, and the regularization of the spelling of some borrowed words. And third edition of GOG was published in 2009 with the aim of making minor amendments to the 2005 report, which sought to differentiate other digraphs like IO or IA and to regularize the spelling of some isolated words that had traditionally been matter of discussion. In general terms, the conventions receive general acceptance for several reasons, one of which is the respect and high esteem for scholarship held by most Gaels, and they have been disseminated and adopted. The major criticism they receive is related to the following cases: the decision to eliminate the acute accent, reflecting the situation found in the mid-18th century, since it seems to be a good idea, especially in the light of printing and publication problems we referred to above, to get rid of as many diacritic marks as possible. The reduction of some spellings concerning the pronunciation of some initial clusters, since some people think that the different spelling forms do not distinguish homophones. The confusion is not likely to mean a lack of comprehension. And the modification of the spelling some words because they did not conform to the spelling rule aforementioned. The simplification of the prefix com, the systematic substitution of the digraph EA for IO, and the reduction of spelling forms to represent the schwa and the spelling of some adverbial compounds and interrogative adverbs. In conclusion, it seems clear that the GOG reforms can be described as largely successful in the sense that they are nowadays recognized by most scholars, writers, and teachers and students as an authority and are generally followed in practice. But there is notable resistance in this attempt to standardize the Scottish Gaelic orthography. In my opinion, the GOG reforms have played a crucial role in standardizing the written form of a language and have important benefits since they have provided consistency and clarity in writing by reducing the regional variations and traditional inconsistencies in written Gaelic. Also, I think that we should be aware that while it did not aim for a phonetic orthography, achieving a phonographic ideal where the written form closely matches its pronunciation is generally assumed to be impossible, and their intention was to respect historical etymology and traditional spelling. Bearing this in mind, I decided to examine the correspondence between pronunciation and spelling in Scottish Gaelic with the aim of detecting the most important inconsistencies that still remain in the language, and to try to offer a solution to them, thinking that a phonetic alphabet always facilitates the learning process and helps promote literacy, especially in endangered languages like Scottish Gaelic. Reading the alphabet and the phonemic inventory, Scottish Gaelic uses 18 letters and has about 16 distinct phonemes, 19 vocalic phonemes and 31 consonant phonemes, and 9 or 10 diphthongs depending on the dialect. The key feature of Scottish Gaelic spelling and phonology is the rule broad to broad, slender to slender, as we explained before, which means that when one or more consonants come in between two vowels, the vowels on either side of the consonant should be of the same class, leading to a distinction between broad or velarized and slender or palatalized consonants. The analysis of the correspondence between graphemes and phonemes in Scottish Gaelic shows the following characteristics. Scottish Gaelic has 5 vowel monographs to represent 19 vocalic phonemes, 10 short and 9 long, and uses the grave accent to represent long vowels. While most vocalic monographs correspond to only 1 or 2 phonemes, or even 3, as is the case of the letter E, 2 vowels, namely A and O, may represent 6 or 7 different sounds respectively. Scottish Gaelic has 12 digraphs, and although a good number of them represent 1, 2, or 3 sounds at most, there are some digraphs like EI, IO, AI, or EA, which may correspond to 4, 5, 7, or even up to 9 different diphthongs, as can be seen in these and the following slide. Scottish Gaelic uses 6 trigraphs to represent 1 or 2 triphthongs, except for one, namely EUAI, which may correspond to 3 different sounds. Regarding the consonants, this language uses 13 consonant monographs, and as can be seen, most of them may correspond to many different phonemes. It is of note that some of the consonant letters, such as C and G, may be pronounced in up to 8 or 9 different ways. Seeing this analysis from the other perspective, that is, examining the way that phonemes are graphically represented, we can observe that firstly, with respect to vowel phonemes, except for 2 phonemes, namely the short and rounded close vowel phoneme and the long rounded mid-high back phoneme, all other vowel phonemes may correspond to many different monographs, digraphs, and even trigraphs. Secondly, as regards diphthongs, there is a stronger correlation between pronunciation and spelling, as the maximum number of spelling forms that diphthongs can adopt is 3. Finally, as regards consonant phonemes, the situation phonemes, since as can be observed in this and the following slide, all consonant phonemes correspond to either only one or two different spelling forms. The results of the analysis shows that there is no one-to-one correspondence between graphemes and phonemes in Scottish Gaelic. However, although this lack of correspondence could in principle affect seriously the reading and writing of the language, most of the discrepancies are solved when the context is examined. Thus, for example, the digraph EA, which may represent up to 9 different sounds, does not raise any problem because each pronunciation of the digraph is associated to a particular context. The same occurs with most consonant letters, as we can see in this slide, where although the letter T may be pronounced in many different ways, it's not difficult to determine the correct sound of the letter, as the pronunciation is contextually determined again. In summary, Scottish Gaelic orthography may be considered to rely heavily on contextual cues, as pronunciation cannot be understood purely from spelling owing to the fact that it must account for lenition, vowel harmony, silent letters, and grammatical case. The only limitations... Sorry. I cannot continue. Sorry. Yes. Okay. The only limitations of Gaelic orthography can be observed, in my opinion, in some situations where there is not a one-to-one correspondence between symbol and sound. As for example, when different words are written analogously, for example, lawn could mean pool, meadow, food, or likelihood, or when the same written form may be pronounced in many different ways depending on the spoken variant of Scottish Gaelic. For example, quile, will could be pronounced as quile, quile, and more importantly, the presence of ambiguity in the pronunciation of some graphemes. The ambiguity produced by the elimination of the acute accent in modern Gaelic has led to having graphemes that can be pronounced in different ways, and these different pronunciations cannot be contextually determined. This is the case of the letter E with an acute accent, with an aggressive accent, which could be pronounced as a mid-high or mid-low long front vowel. The letter O with a grave accent, which could lead to the pronunciation of a mid-high or mid-low long rounded back vowel. It is of note that these words were written with an acute accent in Old Gaelic. The digraph AI, which could correspond to a short open central vowel, a short mid-low front vowel, or a short mid-high and rounded back vowel. The long version of the former digraph, which could be pronounced as a long open central vowel, a closing diphthong, I, or a long mid-low front vowel. The digraph EA, which could correspond to a short mid-low front vowel or a long mid-low rounded back vowel, its long version EA, which could be pronounced as a long mid-low front vowel or an opening diphthong, IA. The digraph EA, which could be representing a long open central vowel or a long mid-low front vowel. The digraph A, which could be pronounced as a long mid-low front vowel or a long mid-high front vowel. The digraph EU, which could represent the opening diphthongs IA and IE. The digraph IA, which could be pronounced exactly as the same as the former. And finally, the digraph IO, which could correspond to a long closed front vowel or an opening diphthong IA. Taking into account that the ambiguity with these spelling forms leads to only 2 different pronunciations, and given that it has traditionally been very important to Scottish Gaelic speakers and scholars that their orthography must strike a balance between preserving the historical and etymological integrity of the language, I think that it would be a good idea to reintroduce the acute accent only to reduce these ambiguities. The presence of the acute accent in one of the options in which these graphemes can be pronounced, it would perhaps be better to use it to represent the less frequent pronunciation, not only would respect the history of the language and the etymology of the words involved, as most of these words were written with an acute accent in the past, but would also make the orthography fully consistent and consequently more phonetic, and would certainly facilitate its learning. As a conclusion to this presentation, I would like to say that, in my opinion, the Koch reforms have been a success, as they have helped to achieve a greater phonic-graphic correspondence, although the orthography is not fully phonetic yet, which is obviously understandable, bearing in mind that the language, as I said before, uses 18 letters to represent 60 different phonemes. I think that the major problem Scottish Gaelic has now is the ambiguity caused by the fact that some vowel letters and digraphs can represent more than one sound, which is not determined by the neighboring sounds or context. due to the fact that there are only 5 vowel letters to represent 19 sounds. And this seriously hinders reading and writing the language. In order to solve the problem, I have proposed the idea of reintroducing the acute accent to represent the less frequent words in every case, since firstly, this would respect etymology, since we have observed most of these words carried the acute accent in Old Gaelic, and secondly, it would continue the historical tradition as the acute accent was already used in the past to disambiguate words. Finally, although it's true that acute accent would have more than one use, as it would serve to represent different phonemes in terms of quantity and quality, it would at least make orthography more consistent and coherent because these words are not very numerous, so it could foster literacy in this endangered language, thereby contributing to its preservation and revitalization. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi there, can you hear me better?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so you mentioned that some consonant graphemes have several different possible pronunciations. How many of those are disambiguated by the vowels around them? For instance, in the case of broad and slender consonants, you mentioned that you can tell what the pronunciation is based on the surrounding vowels. So how much ambiguity still exists in the consonants, even when you take into account the vowels around them? And by the way, I found your presentation very helpful. As someone who works on Scottish Gaelic, thank you.
Thank you for your question. If I understood well your question, consonants, not only consonants, but the pronunciation of this language as well as the spelling of this language follow a rule that I mentioned before. This spelling rule is related to the fact that all consonants can have 2 different pronunciations. One of them is considered to be broad, and the other one is considered to be slender, depending on whether the sound is velarized or palatalized. This pronunciation of each consonant depends on the neighboring vowels. And according to this rule, the 2 neighboring consonants of a vowel should be belonging to the same type. So this is something that is contextually determined. And there are some exceptions, and the exceptions have been retained according to GOC because changing the spelling of these exceptions in order to adapt them to the spelling rule would change the historical tradition of this word and could create more confusion than help.
Question? Another question? Okay. One more question. One of the things that Scottish Gaelic is known for is the 3-way sonorant contrast with velar and palatal L and R sounds. How well is that disambiguated in the orthography?
In the same way as before, the pronunciation of the consonants is always contextually determined. So once you learn the context in which a consonant can be pronounced as a velarized or palatalized, everything seems to be very easy. This is the reason why it doesn't need to be modified in the orthography. According to this, GOC reforms have never touched this and modify this, because this is not the real problem with the pronunciation. Although we have very few letters to represent a great number of phonemes, most of them are contextually determined. So whenever you learn the basic rules, okay, or the basic context in which the consonants can appear, and even, for example, taking into account that the language presents a lot of silent letters and consonant classes that are never pronounced, but although they are not pronounced, they still affect the neighboring consonants, it's easy to read the language or to write the language. Okay? But the real problem comes from the ambiguities I pointed out that affect some vowel phonemes and some diagraphs that, for example, there are some graphemes that could be pronounced in more than 8 ways. But most of these different ways of pronouncing the grapheme are contextually determined. So they are not, in fact, a problem when the learner has learned the rules. The problem comes with these very few cases in which 2 possible interpretations or representations, phonetic representations of the same grapheme are not depending on the context. this is the reason why I think that it would be a good idea to reintroduce the acute accent and mark one of the two options with the acute accent to make it different from the other word, the other pronunciation. By doing this, we at least should respect the etymology, because the acute accent was used in the past, and I have been examining how these words were written in the past in Old Gaelic, and they most of them carry the acute accent. So I think that it would not be a bad idea to reintroduce the acute accent. I know that maybe, for example, as I mentioned in my presentation, the first criticism could be that the introduction of the acute accent to disambiguate these words would not be consistent, because it would be used to represent many different phonemes, long vowels, short vowels, closing diphthongs, opening diphthongs. So this is not very consistent, but at least as the number of these ambiguities is not so long, and it only affects a limited number of words, it could help to read and write the language more easily or more effectively.
So my last question from Dan. Just a quick comment. Hello, Kimaraho. I agree with you completely. Bring the acute accent back, but I got to tell you there's a downside, which is Scottish Gaelic got Scrabble last year. And it's got something that I've never seen for any other language, which is vowels that you get 6 points for. And if the acute accent comes back, it's going to be like 8 points, and it's going to make Scrabble playing even harder. So there's a downside.
Yeah. Well, at least in comparison with other orthographies or other languages, at least this language would only use two diacritics, the grave accent and acute accent, that it would be not too much. Okay.